right.
Okay. Their grand challenge, right? Also, we are at a time when there is a growing awareness of environmental justice issues around the planet, often related to the extractive sector. We also see a generation coming of age, many of whom we're teaching, that are concerned about resource colonialism, that history we all share. Also, we have increasing recognition around the world of the rights of Indigenous people and other marginalized groups. In the mining space, we often see projects that are contested not just by groups of local community members living near where the mine may be, but environmental NGOs are bringing global stakeholders to the table. Robert Redford opposed the Pebble mine. He doesn't live there, right? At the same time, we also see this not in my backyard phenomenon. And I don't think anybody is interested in creating energy sacrifice zones around the planet where we decimate particular areas just so that we can transition to renewables. In the US, the Biden administration is prioritizing domestic supply of critical minerals, and you've probably seen a lot of that in the news, but our permitting process isn't really working. In fact, in Minnesota, the Twin Metals project, which is one of the biggest potential critical mineral projects in the US, just had their leases revoked again. At the same time, because of some of the concerns about resource colonialism and human rights issues associated with mining critical minerals elsewhere in the world, the DRC and cobalt comes to mind, we see new markets for ethically sourced critical minerals and things like gold as well. And because of all of this noise, there's also the potential for greenwashing projects that are not necessarily doing things in a different way, but maybe they're looking at something that just became part of the critical minerals list, or they have critical minerals in the deposit, but those aren't the main commodity, or it is a critical mineral deposit, but it's being mined in the same way as we've mined in the past. And those projects are getting greenwashed to say, this is all new, it's different, it's energy transition, it's not the mining you're used to. And that is very problematic. What are we going to do about that? How are we going to solve the grand challenge of getting the critical minerals that we need? That's why we put together this team, the Responsible Critical Minerals team. I don't know. Where I put it, it's going to be in the way.
Hit those 3 dots.
3 dots.
And see where it says hide floating.
Hide floating meeting controls. Yeah. Okay. Now I won't be able to find them again. So you don't tell me how to do it. I can't win today. Don't touch anything. So we put together our team, the Responsible Critical Minerals team, under the NSF solicitation, Growing Convergence Research. So in this, 10 PIs are allowed from 10 different disciplines. So these are the people that are formally on our team, and our team is actually much bigger than that. So a lot of people have had collaborations with us in other ways. But you can see that we span the mining life cycle, from me at the front end with mineral exploration, all the way to Morgan at the back end with public policy and everything in between. Let's. There it is. Okay. So we also have amazing grad students and postdocs and research faculty on our team. And I wanted to highlight those people too. Many of the slides that I will present show work from these people. So what are we doing in this project? We're bringing together social science, physical science, and engineering to define metrics for what might constitute responsible critical minerals development or other earth resource development. And we're using 3 kind of thematic guiding principles. The first is sustainable development, the idea of letting future generations not be inhibited by the things that we're doing. The second is resource efficiency. And I used this analogy in teaching earlier today. I'm sorry if there are vegetarians in the room. This is the idea of getting more out of the cow, right? You're going to eat beef, let's use it all. Can we get more out of the resources that we're using already? And the third principle is environmental justice. So what are we doing? It's a lot. I'm going to share some of our case studies with you today, but I think people are generally interested in this project and what it is that we're doing on campus. So I wanted to give you the broader context. We're identifying case study sites. We're doing the technical work on the left-hand side. We're doing the social science work on the right-hand side to understand stakeholders and their priorities. We're looking at processes for critical mineral recovery and identifying the methods that would optimize stakeholder values within those technical constraints, modeling these potential scenarios for critical mineral recovery. We're also empowering students in what we're calling a convergence class. I know a couple people are in that class, and we're doing this in combination with Fort Lewis College in Durango. They're a Native American serving institution. And so their students have often very different perspectives on resource development and different lived experiences and different academic disciplines from our students. So we're bringing those students together to talk about energy transitions, energy sovereignty, environmental justice, and critical minerals. And then we have a phase 2 where we do this whole thing all over again, and then we develop policy recommendations. And our major goal is to catalyze convergence around these ideas from an interdisciplinary perspective in the greater community. So NSF is actually probably measuring us on that more than on the scientific outputs. So we're measuring ourselves with network diagnostics. The thing on the left is sort of supposed to show this ripple effect. We get these 10 faculty together. We're working super hard to understand one another's disciplinary perspectives on critical minerals, and also one another's lived experiences related to this grand challenge, and figuring out how to do research together. That is not easy. We've had some interesting and tense and enlightening and breakthrough conversations. I'm smiling at Eric in the back because he's been such a great partner for all of this. And it has been painful and a joy at the same time. Really, really hard to do that kind of work. And then we're bringing in other organizations, industry collaborators, federal agencies, the broader academic community, and trying to make this ripple effect grow, including our students who will go out and hopefully take leadership roles in the energy transition. The idea, I also showed this same slide in my class this morning, is to take all of these different ingredients and make a smoothie, come to some sort of shared understanding of what responsible critical mineral. I wanted to show you all that before I get into the case studies, because these are just really snapshots of the research that we're doing. We have a lot of different case studies, and I'll only share the ones that are the most directly relevant to, I think, most of our audience is in the geo and mining space. So we're talking about 4 possible modes of critical mineral supply. In reality, all 4 of them will be needed to meet demand. I'm not going to talk about recycling. One, it isn't my area, but 2, more importantly, the uses of critical minerals are dispersive and dissipative, and there isn't enough out there right now to recycle to build out the infrastructure that we need. So let's talk about the first 3. Main product operations. These would be new mines in the US that would exploit a critical mineral like cobalt, for example, as the main product. So we're doing case studies in Idaho cobalt belt and also in Minnesota. We're also looking at potential of critical mineral recovery as byproducts from existing mining operations where they haven't been recovered before and they're going into waste right now. So my favorite example is from Carlin in Nevada, and I'll give you a little bit of a vignette from that. We're also looking for another byproduct site that he has ideas. And then lastly, we're looking at critical mineral recovery from mine wastes like Red Dog in Alaska, also Alaskan placer districts, and we did a short study in Coeur d'Alene in Idaho as well. So the goal of what I'm going to share with you sort of from the science side is to demonstrate the importance of convergent or interdisciplinary assessment of the critical mineral potential from any of these sites. You cannot see it through one disciplinary lens alone, or you'll miss the big points. So let's talk about cobalt at first. It's important for energy storage, deemed critical by the USGS and the majority of criticality studies around the world since 2014. Many of you have heard about child labor and other human rights concerns associated with cobalt mining. And it's concentrated in few locations and relatively few deposit sites. So we're looking at hurdles and opportunities for domestic cobalt production. This is a map that we just made. Joe Trova put it together. And this shows you the locations of different cobalt mines on Earth by mineralogy. So that's what the dot color is. The dot size is the size of the reserve. And then you see those black symbols, one of which is covered, and I'm scared to move this. Okay. Which shows you how the cobalt is actually processed. And you'll notice that particular colors of dots tend to go to particular types of symbols: roasters, smelters, autoclave, bioleach, heap leach, and then the lightning bolt is the refinery. So we're focusing in the Idaho cobalt belt where there's this question mark. And some of those dotted potential supply chains show you where that material might go, possibly. So notice also the geographic sort of disproportionate distribution of cobalt on Earth, right? There just isn't as much cobalt that we know about in the United States as there is in other places. So let's go to the Idaho cobalt belt, where there are at present 45-ish known occurrences of cobalt, copper, plus or minus gold mineralization in the southwest portion of the belt Purcell Basin. Copper occurs as chalcopyrite. Cobalt occurs as cobaltite at Ram and Blackbird, cobalt-bearing arsenopyrite at Black Pine, and cobalt-bearing pyrite at Iron Creek. Let's go back to this map really quick. So we're looking at the red dot and the pink dot. There aren't very many other red and pink dots on the map, right? So that means maybe there's not necessarily the processing infrastructure for those red and pink dots already. Think about where this might go when we mine it. So let's talk about the geology for a minute. The company Electra Battery Materials has an underground mining scenario with an indicated resource of 12.3 million pounds of cobalt and 29 million pounds of copper. These are some pictures of drill core with cobalt ore on the top and cobalt copper ore on the bottom. The sparkly things are sulfides, mostly pyrite, which has cobalt in it, and chalcopyrite. So Katafaf has been instrumental in helping us with the automated mineralogy on these samples. The ones that we've looked at have a lot of pyrite, up to 67% in some samples, and also lots of chalcopyrite. The deposit has two zones. It has a copper cobalt zone and a cobalt zone. So in the copper cobalt zone, you get more chalcopyrite. So the yellow is the pyrite, where it's reddish colored is where it has cobalt in it. And the orange is chalcopyrite. You can see at the thin section scale, in our samples at least, these are really intergrown, not occurring separately. There's also a mineral in the cadierite basite solid solution series, which is a cobalt nickel sulfide up to 2%. So here are some other images from Kata, where you see cobalt ore on the left and cobalt copper ore on the right. The blue is the chalcopyrite, and the red is mostly cobalt-bearing pyrite. And you can actually see that in this picture of the ore body, although of course the colors are exactly the opposite. The red is the copper zone, copper cobalt zone, and the blue is just the cobalt. So you can see that there's some places in the ore body where these two minerals occur together, and that's where some of our samples are from. And then there are some places where you have more chalcopyrite and more cobalt-bearing pyrite. So that is important. Let's look at what trace elements there are. And Xiaoxian helped us with analyzing our samples with laser relation CMS, which is wonderful because we can look at the other trace element distributions. These are all pyrite. But even plain old pyrite can be pretty exciting. The top maps are cobalt, then you've got bismuth, tellurium, silver. We also looked at nickel. We looked at a lot of different metals. And we can see that these are not your boring old plain pyrite. They've got lots of things in them. So that's cool. The economic geologist in me is very excited about that. I love ore deposits. I love the mineralogy in them. But why do we need to look at this from an interdisciplinary perspective? Well, let's go back to that map. Where could this material be processed? We're talking about domestic supply chains. And the White House statement actually says domestic supply chains for the production, refining, and manufacturing, or something like that. So it does clarify not only the mining, but also the processing. Where would this happen? Well, there's nowhere, actually nowhere in the world where you could just take this ore and get all of those things out of it. It's just the facts. If you wanted, you could send it perhaps to a new autoclave or a new roaster, sorry, that's being built in Australia. Cobalt Blue is building an autoclave, or they have a roaster, demonstration roaster right now, where they're trying to recover cobalt from cobaltiferous pyrite. There are also autoclaves, one in Ontario, Canada, and one is being constructed in Missouri. The company that has just started mining in the Idaho cobalt belt, that's the pink dot, the RAM deposit. They're sending that cobaltite ore to Brazil. And you see the pink arrow going to Brazil. They're refurbishing an HPAL facility, which was for lateritic ores, and turning it into a cobalt nickel autoclave. So let's go to these textures again. Do you remember how that orange chalcopyrite was intergrown with the pyrite? Well, first you mine, then hopefully Eric's nodding here. Hopefully I'm not getting this too wrong, right? First you mine, then you reduce the size, then you need to liberate the minerals and separate and concentrate your material. So if you wanted to do this in the Idaho cobalt belt, all of these deposits actually have their cobalt minerals intergrown to some extent with chalcopyrite. So how are you going to get all of that stuff out? Well, could you float a sulfide concentrate and send it all to a smelter? This is work that Joe Trova has really helped us figure out. None of the 3 smelters in the US can recover cobalt. Combined cobalt or copper cobalt smelters in Africa and China aren't designed for pyrite. Basically too much SO2. So that's not good. And we also know, I didn't talk about it, but there's indium and zinc in the chalcopyrite, just a little, but those are critical minerals too. And there isn't a smelter that could recover those alongside the cobalt and the copper. So what if you built a smelter in the Idaho cobalt belt? That's one possibility. Well, let's look at the Idaho cobalt belt. The total metal content is undefined. But if you look at just the indicated resource from Iron Creek, remember they're early on in their exploration process, right? It would meet 10 months of domestic cobalt demand right now, and less than 2 months in 2050, less than a day for copper. If you add the RAM deposit, you could meet, I think I just recalculated it, it's about a year of projected demand in 2050, assuming we keep using cobalt the way all the experts think we're going to. So are we going to build a giant expensive smelter for the Idaho cobalt belt that could recover both the cobalt and the copper together? Not. It would have to be purpose built in order to be able to recover both of those things together. These deposits, though, are of huge strategic importance because they're next in size in terms of cobalt endowment to the Minnesota deposits, where we know we're having environmental and regulatory concerns and not able to move some of those projects forward. So if we're not going to build a purpose-built smelter, could we mine the copper zone separately at some of these deposits and send that material to a US copper smelter? That's one possibility. There aren't any domestic metallurgical cobalt producers. We talked about these facilities that are under construction. Electra Battery Materials is building this hydromet facility or refurbishing one in Ontario, Canada. And you could send everything there, but it really wouldn't be good to send all that chalcopyrite there. As far as I understand it, this is pretty low throughput, and the cobalt minerals are worth much more. So if you send chalcopyrite through, you're basically limiting how much cobalt you can produce. We figured out from our samples, at least, if you could ideally actually separate all the chalcopyrite You could send that to a US copper smelter, and you could send the cobalt minerals to this facility in Ontario. And if you could get them completely separated from our samples, then you have a concentrate that's about 5% cobalt. Think about those textures one more time in your mind. It's going to be really hard to completely separate out those minerals, right? We haven't talked about the trace metals at all. It was a really heartbreaking moment in the project and very revelatory for me and for Nina Zaranacola, who is our geochemist. We were getting all excited talking to our metallurgists about what's in these minerals. Look, there's silver, there's bismuth, there's lead, there's selenium, there's tellurium, there's gold, there's antimony. Like, no, it's never going to be worth it to recover those. So some of it is actually lattice bound in the pyrite, and some of it is as inclusions. So if you could actually separate out these 10 micron size inclusions, you could send that to a precious metals processor. That's my understanding. But in order to do that, you'd have to crush and grind this material to be really, really fine. And mining and basically breaking big rocks into little rocks is one of the biggest energy consumers in the US. So why would we be doing that for critical minerals when there's not that much there in the first place? I was really, really sad to hear that this is going to end up in the waste. If you don't smelt it, you're not going to be able to recover the tellurium. Things like tellurium, really smelting creates streams of material that are concentrated that then you can recover. But we already decided it's probably not going to be worth building a purpose-built smelter, right? So that's going to end up in waste too. As a geologist, I find this heartbreaking because the concentration of everything is never zero in anything, right? And I want to be able to get that all out. I want resource efficiency. But in the current economic and policy framework, it's just not doable. So it's going to be in the wastes. Our wastes are going to be really exciting for future generations, but will they have the breakthrough technology that will be able to process them? I don't know. So this is what we came up with. These are the different options. The nitrogen atmosphere roaster in Australia, a new smelter, an autoclave. Maybe you could build a purpose-built autoclave for the Idaho cobalt belt that would be right there, and you wouldn't have to ship material so far. And there could be tolling so that these companies could actually work together and share one facility. Probably not going to do bacterial leach because the cobalt recovery would be poor, and so would atmospheric leach. All of those trace elements in red are going to be in the wastes. The elements in green are the ones that you're going to be able to recover alongside the cobalt. There are various challenges and advantages, very serious things like social opposition to prior technologies, deleterious arsenic, high capital expenditure, high operating cost, slow reaction kinetics. But there are some potential advantages too. So we think probably what's going to happen is that all this material will go to autoclave, maybe with some separation of the chalcopyrite. And maybe you'll be able to produce usable acid, and for an autoclave, there's some tolerance for impurities. So that's what it might look like. But can you see how you couldn't figure that problem out? I'm just getting excited about the mineralogy. And I don't know that we've completely figured it out. Our next thing that we're going to do is look at the broader context. We are actually hosting a workshop in Idaho in April for the companies that are working in the area, and also potentially for stakeholders to start to understand the stakeholder context and perspectives and what do people think about the Idaho cobalt belts and critical mineral recovery in Idaho, and how is it different from critical mineral recovery in other places? Who counts as a stakeholder? Does criticality make a difference? Are people more likely to approve something because it's a critical minerals project than some other sort of project? I don't think so. Have to see. Another option is, we're making policy recommendations. Should there be federal subsidies for recovery of byproduct metals that are going to go into wastes? Or are we going to just leave them there? That's something that we could recommend, because economics favor optimal but never maximal metal recoveries. And then I hope that all of this will bring more research funding into R&D in this space, because I think that we need it. Think of the things that we can figure out. We had more attention that way. So key points for new main product critical mineral mines. Geological characteristics lead to engineering constraints. Can't hand the project like a baton from one discipline to the next and expect that you're going to come out with a different answer. Those engineering constraints affect public perception. And I also think it's really important that these deposits in Idaho should be considered of strategic importance, although they're not going to cover all of our critical mineral needs in the energy transition. And lastly, we need to integrate all disciplines, and I think everybody has to get together to design development in the Idaho Cobalt Belt for public approval. We want to be able to do this. Everybody's voice has to be heard, and we have to come up with projects that everybody's happy with. And if you can't make 10 faculty members on a Zoom call happy, I don't know how you do this more broadly, but we're coming up with ideas. So now let's talk about mine waste recovery of critical minerals. Changing gears. We were talking about wastes, right? Let's talk about wastes that we have already. So critical minerals could be the primary economic focus, and this is happening in Missouri. US Strategic Metals is doing this for cobalt leftover from Mississippi Valley type tailings. You could have a critical mineral that's a byproduct that wasn't previously recovered, and now it's being recovered alongside the main product. So for example, germanium that's associated with zinc in tailings from, say, a SADX deposit. And then the third option is where the critical mineral is associated with a host mineral that would require novel processes to recover it economically. So like tellurium hosted in pyrite and porphyry copper tailings. We don't really have a great way to get that out, right? So how do you go about thinking about which mine wastes on the planet are the best place to go and look for critical minerals? The federal government has a priority right now on waste as a resource, but I don't think we really know how to do this particularly effectively. One great start that has been made is that the USGS got together with Geoscience Australia and the Geologic Survey of Canada, and they basically reanalyzed all of the ore samples that they had. Things that were like on people's desks or whatever, been used in prior projects. And they analyzed them for more elements, 67 elements mostly, than had been analyzed before. So previously, we didn't know the critical mineral content of some of these ore samples around which sort of geologic models for deposit formation have been constructed. So the idea is to think about deposit types that are potentially prospective for the critical mineral of interest. I also think we should consider size and the potential for a net environmental benefit if we're going to go ahead and reprocess tailings. And then there's the consideration about whether it's historic or operating. And I say tailings, but there are really lots of different types of mine waste. Tailings is the one we're focusing on right. So from that USGS, Geoscience Australia, Geoscience Canada database, the idea was that maybe you could develop some correlations. So say you have a zinc mine, and you never analyzed for some of these other things because there wouldn't be a reason to in the past, and it would be expensive to analyze for more elements. And now you have this huge database for, say, your main product, which let's imagine it's zinc, and you don't know how much else of these other things are in there. Well, Nadal Nasser's wheel of companionality there shows you sort of the association between common metals. So you'd expect if you had a zinc deposit that you might also have, say, cadmium or indium or germanium, because they often occur together geologically. So could you use your zinc data to then predict how much cadmium or indium or germanium you might have? Well, it seems to possibly work okay for cadmium, for example. This is from SADX deposits from that database. Indium, I'm not sure I would feel comfortable saying I have X amount of zinc, therefore I have Y amount of indium. Gallium and germanium, it gets even worse, right? These are limited data sets. They don't have all the samples on the planet, right? But it's going to be really difficult to use this in a predictive way to be able to go out and feel comfortable remining your tailings, saying, yes, I know how much is in there. So what we decided to do in our case study at Red Dog in Alaska is spend some time developing a framework for how you would actually go about assessing the reprocessing potential of tailings. So we've pulled together a database where we think we have most of the academic studies that have considered this, and it's not many, it's less than 100. And we also did a review of various industry reports, and the time that the tailings reprocessing comes up is not that many. So we're looking at trying to develop a method for how you would go about assessing your tailings. Red Dog is exciting because it's one of the world's biggest critical mineral mines. Zinc is a critical mineral right now. And they have some higher zinc grades in their historic tailings, and they're wondering what else might be down there and whether there might be critical minerals that they could recover and reprocess the tailings and get zinc and other things out. It's also challenging because it's 170 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle. So we have looked at some of their existing tailings, and then we're also looking at critical minerals and other elements in off-the-line tailings that are coming off now, and then basically spaced out over time. And then we're planning this summer to go and do some sampling, probably hand augering of the tailing storage facility to try to get some sense of depth variation and spatial heterogeneity. But we're not going to be able to get down to the bottom of it without doing something really invasive, and we're probably not likely to go take a drill rig out onto that material and try to drill it. So you're kind of working blind here. These are some automated mineralogy work that we did of a flotation concentrate that shows you that there's quite a bit of sphalerite, that's the red, the zinc sulfide, in the tailings still. Small particle size. And we also don't have a good sense of how weathered the historic tailings might actually be. So we're going to skip over that and just say that right now, there is no recipe for how you go about assessing tailings for reprocessing. There's no good truth stick. There's no good database that tells you how much you have. But yet everybody's really excited about this. And it might be the most environmentally and socially friendly way to get the critical minerals we need. But the US and the world has got mine waste everywhere, and we don't know what's in them. I think that that is gravely concerning. We have to be able to do more of this, and that involves money and time and research. So what we hope to present to Red Dog is a concept for how they might modify their decommissioning plan if they were actually going to go and reprocess the tailings that are in that TSF. I will have to tell you more about that another time because it's still in progress. So I think we're going to skip over the last part because we got a slow start here. And I won't be able to tell you about byproducts today, but I will another time. In closing, I want to bring together some of the bigger picture thoughts here. I don't think that you can evaluate critical mineral potential from one disciplinary perspective. This is a really multifaceted problem, and it needs an interdisciplinary framework. I also think that the public doesn't really care if it's a critical mineral mine that you're building in an area that they care about, whether it's their backyard or a place that looks beautiful in a picture that they've seen. So we have to come up with new ways to do this. Just saying it's for the energy transition isn't going to be enough. And we're going to end up with a problem where we can't mine, but we need to. And I also think that we need new models for how to plan how mining is done. And that means partnering with the people who are going to use the materials that we mine, so the OEMs, for example, as well as communities, partnering with environmental NGOs to design the projects from start to finish. I was having a conversation with one of our industry partners the other day, and they said, you know, we thought that science would win the day in the end, but it didn't. So the science isn't enough. We need to think about this differently, and I think that means incorporating all of these different aspects. So that's all I have time for today, but there's obviously lots more. Happy to talk to you another time.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Questions for Elizabeth? Comments? Lou?
I'm curious to what extent the team forward thinking goes so far to consider what would happen if there were, for example, some sort of significant game changer. Sudden availability of energy, so fusion or something like that. You guys think about that and how it might impact?
You know, more broadly, I think we're thinking about what energy transitions look like. This isn't the first one, right? whale oil, that was an energy transition too, right? Humans have made lots of energy transitions. And I think we can't discount disruptive, game-changing events. But in this project specifically, our job is to think about critical mineral supply and if we could do that domestically. So we're pretty focused on that.
I'm a little curious, and this is because, you know, mining is not my wheelhouse necessarily, but how critical minerals are defined, it seems that it's such a binary designation that even if you found a big deposit in the United States of critical minerals, all of a sudden it's not a critical mineral, right? So is there a grading, or how do minerals fly in and out of the critical designation?
There's actually a great, I think, USGS presentation on how the list is developed in the United States, but it really focuses on supply chain vulnerability. I think you can think of as the underpinning aspect. So criticality doesn't have a whole lot to do with usefulness or requirements for the energy transition. Arsenic and antimony, those are the byproduct cases that I was going to talk to you about. Those don't sound particularly exciting, right? We have lots and lots and lots of arsenic and antimony in our deposits, and we throw it away because we don't like it, but we also don't produce it domestically. And so for things like gallium arsenide, we need it. And so they are actually critical minerals. There's also some politics involved. Uranium was delisted and zinc was added, and that changes. So new lists are published every couple of years. Brad Eggert is really our campus expert on how critical minerals. You can probably talk more about that.
When you talk about the problems with refining certain types of deposits in the US, and you looked at it the other way around, and as the industry looking at building refining capacity from those traditional ore deposits to attract them to the United States, so we have refining capacity.
Now I'm getting out of my depth because remember, I'm a geologist. So I'm trying to present the work from the whole team here.
Sorry, yeah.
So I can turn this over to Jay and Eric in a second, but I think we're not very good at bringing new facilities online in the US. So that's part of it. Anybody over there from our mining engineering team want to answer that question?
No, Sheldon, it's a permitting. A lot of it is a permitting issue. It boils down to permitting. How do you permit a new mine? What kind of liabilities you're assuming if you go in and start messing with the tailings? Is your company big enough to swallow that risk?
So I'll just go along with that. Elizabeth, as we were talking, Eric and I were talking, you know, that's a great thing, a great presentation. But one of the big challenges with going into brownfield operations as well as mining waste is the antecedent environmental liabilities. And under CERCLA, you're dead. I mean, if you came into, you know, you named a couple of great places, Sholo, parts of Idaho, Silver Valley. You imagine Bunker Hill's got $1.5 billion of liability you would assume by just going in and drilling holes. I mean, this is just horrifying unless there's, you know, Good Samaritan legislation's passed or something like that.
Absolutely. And in our conversations, that's why I didn't talk about the Coeur d'Alene case study, because we realized, one, if we're thinking about cobalt specifically, there's not enough there to merit any of that, right? But two, all of those organizations were happy to talk to us and say, this is a great thought experiment, but there is no way anybody's letting you do that, right? And that's a problem. On one hand, you've got federal research priorities that are examining waste as a resource. And on the other hand, you have a regulatory framework that doesn't allow that to actually move forward. I think US Strategic Metals is one of the exceptions.
I noticed on your world map, you had a couple colored dots in Idaho, the pyrite and then the cobaltite, I think it was called. That there's a color that wasn't anywhere else in the world. What's unique about Idaho that led to those conditions forming?
So you're asking a question about the genesis of the deposits, which we're doing kind of a side project using unconventional copper and zinc isotopes to actually look at the characteristics of formation of mineralization. And there is sort of a gradation through the belt from cobaltiferous pyrite to cobaltiferous arsenopyrite to cobaltite. And I don't think that it is really fully understood right now. There's some great USGS research. Kata has been working on the Idaho cobalt belt as well. But every time I write a short description of how the deposit formed, then some reviewer says, that's not how I think it formed, so change that. So the jury's still out.
So you mentioned the bioleaching is not going to be good because of a cobalt recovery is low. But if cobalt is associated with a pyrite, chalcopyrite, and then cobaltite is a sulfide, then I think the bioleaching should work very well. So I know you didn't spend a lot of time in the processing side, but I think there's some opportunity to use the bioleaching, bio-oxidation technology, because those bugs really like the sulfurs, so they can oxidize, and then most of the acid soluble materials will be in the solution. So if it works in a pressure oxidation and then roasting or smelting, and the bio leaching should work very well too. So.
Just to talk more about that, obviously this isn't my area at all. So Joe and I worked together to put together that table, and that was his assessment. I know at Kasisi in Uganda, there was a bioleaching operation, and I don't, for cobaltiferous pyrite, I don't think it worked particularly well, but I'm not sure which data he was using to develop that assessment. It'd be fun to sit down, and maybe there's more there are more options than we thought. That would be fantastic. This is the value of interdisciplinary conversation.
Questions for Elizabeth? While you're thinking of some, I have one. So in a former life, I was executive in mining, and I worked all over the world and all these things, and I have a healthy concern that none of this will become economic. It's too hard, right? But I love what you're doing. And so the question that I have is, we'd love for all of our research to be successful. We're going to somehow solve society's problems around various things. But in the fact, this looks like an awesome opportunity to educate and train them. So how is that workforce development piece going on here? So it is our students and the people we work with, as well as how you can use this to educate the broader society. How does that look?
Well, John's in our class. I think that the class is still very experimental. The students are being very brave about that. We're talking about the energy transition broadly, as well as the critical minerals problem specifically, and really trying to rethink. We talked today about counter stories. This is the way it is now, but how could it be? What could those disruptive, game-changing things be? Part of our role is as a convening unit, really. And so in the next couple of months, we're starting our webinar panel series. And so you'll see invitations come out about that. And I hope that people here who are interested will participate in that. Our goal is to really spark broader conversation. And I was saying in the supply chains forum that we had here on campus the other day, this is why this is funded by NSF, because it's that crazy, right? That when you get all these disciplines together, maybe you'll solve the problem. Maybe you'll come up with a practical, patentable solution. Maybe you won't, but maybe you'll move the needle a little bit. And I often too look to the students and say, well, that's the biggest product here.
I can add for the class a lot of non-mining students. So to give them a technical description of how it all works helps them. If they think, oh, it's a great idea, we're gonna do it, then they realize it's not so easy. I think that goes to the education and spreading awareness.
Other questions for Elizabeth?
See if there's
See if there's online, we might have someone.
Okay, thanks for the presentation. Recycling. Could you elaborate why it's not in this scenario? Recycling anthropogenic materials is a relevant research topic. Absolutely. I know that there is plenty of work happening in, is it CR3 is the acronym for the mines focused, recycling focused research group. And I would encourage you to check them out and see what they're doing. I'm a little biased because I kind of started the project and I'm a geologist. And so I thought, well, there's no room for me in that space. So let's make our scope a little bit smaller, but recycling is absolutely important.
That's the only one online?
Only one. Oh, wait. Thanks. I like that one.
Over there.
Thanks.
Thanks. All right, so how about this? Let us join in thanking Elizabeth, and she gives the proverbial CSM crystal
Wow.
deal. So, thank you very much. All right, thanks, everybody.
Pizza across the hall.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah. It's like, comedy solution.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Thank you.